So for the last talk and keynote, actually, we have Mark Dingemanse, who I met about 9 months ago at a workshop in Edinburgh, and we had this conversation about dynamic land and other things, and he just clicked saying, you know, I actually wrote something about this a few years ago, which had a similar title. So let's see how this goes.
Do I use that one?
Yes. Sorry, I'm just trying to go. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So in a way, I'm glad to be at the very end because I get to stand on the shoulders of all of you. There's a lot of common ground already. I think early on, almost every single one of us could say, I feel like an outsider here. And I mean, maybe this is still the case, but I also feel that we've built quite some common ground today, and I'm just going to take that for granted, to a great deal at least, and launch straight into brain-to-brain interfaces. So what about them? Well, you will have seen headlines like this in the last few years. The science of telepathy. Brain-to-brain interface, the next great leap in human communication. Why brain-to-brain communication is no longer unthinkable. So there are prototypes nowadays, and there's this big dream of perhaps a mind meld, of perhaps directly connecting brains. Now this was mused about a couple decades ago already by the late Murray Gell-Mann, Nobel Prize winner. And he wrote about this in his book, The Quark and the Jaguar. And he wrote that at some point we'll be able to connect people through computers. And he muses, thoughts and feelings would be completely shared with none of the selectivity or deception that language permits. Let's just see what has come from that in recent years. So there are prototypes now of brain-to-brain interfaces that look schematically like this. You start with a computer screen, somebody looking at it. That person is wearing an EEG cap. Some aspect of their brain signals is picked up by a server. That server sends it over the internet to another server. And that server, in turn, is connected to somebody who is wired up with a TMS coil, TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And that coil is positioned in such a way that the person can touch a touchpad, can move the hand to touch the touchpad. Now, when I say that person can move the hand, it works a little differently. So this is what it actually looks like in real life. Here's this person looking at the screen, EEG cap on. He's instructed, I mean, this is kind of a game, a bit like Space Invaders in a way, if you know that, an old school game. And this person cannot move any limbs, or is supposed not to move any limbs, but is instructed to think of either hand or feet. Signals that that are easily distinguishable in the sensory motor cortex, with which this EEG cap is picking up on, and so we get a binary 1 or 0, basically. And then on the other end, there's this person with this TMS coil. There's not a lot of agency here, I think you will agree. And so this right here is the TMS coil, right? And that is positioned in such a way that for this person specifically, because this is of course also partly individually varied, for this person specifically, what it will do is when it pulses on the 1 coming from the other end, then the finger will move like that. The finger will move. The person is not moving the finger. I don't think it's fair to say. No, I think, so that coil is positioned right close to the sensory motor cortex, where actually a pulse will simply result in an involuntary movement like that, right? So that is basically the stage that we're at right now with brain-to-brain interfaces, brain-to-brain communication. It's become slightly more sophisticated in recent years, but not much more than this, to be honest. So this is 2014-15. I think it's hugely interesting, though. And obviously the people working on this also think so. So they will say stuff like, bypassing language altogether will revolutionize how humans communicate and collaborate. There is now the possibility of a new era in which brains will dialogue in a more direct way. Well, I mean, I think we can all agree that it's certainly direct, right? This TMS coil just basically resulting in this twitch. It is direct. No, but I mean, let's face it. And I want to keep this as constructive as possible, because I do think that this kind of technology is here to stay. It will become more sophisticated. And one major question we are facing right now is, will we let the engineers basically do their stuff? Or will we also, as scholars of human interaction, as scientists of language, will we also have a say in how these kinds of things are designed in an ethical, in a humane way? And that's part of what I want to contribute here. I don't want to ridicule any technology here. I have to say, though, and this brings me back to my own background, this particular implementation, this crude prototype, makes me think most of chickens. Chickens. Let me explain why. This is the mountain village in eastern Ghana where I do field work. I've spent about 2 years there learning the language. I'm an African linguist originally, trained as a specialist in African languages and linguistics. And I've done field work on this language because it hadn't been described before in detail. And for various other reasons, including, of course, the nice place and the beautiful climate. Now, I make recordings of everyday life in this village and study how people interact using language. But I said that this system made me think more of chickens. So let me explain why. So this is a regular kind of setting that you encounter in this village, right? So people have some fruits or some in this case, palm fruits. And the chickens are always around looking for food. Always looking, always browsing, always trying to find some food. And so people have to chase away chickens. People have to shoo them away. A lot. This happens often. There is a specific word for this that I duly entered in my dictionary of this language, and it's shoo. It's the word you use to chase away chickens, right? And so I wrote down in my dictionary, shoo, call used to shoo away birds, especially domestic fowl. And while writing this, I thought, wait, shoo, what's that about? It's probably just a coincidence, right? That these words sound similar. I decided to look it up. So here is shue in Siwu, there is shoo in English. And there's about maybe 17 other languages that I could find data for on words for shooing away animals, specifically chickens or birds. And it looks like this. Ash, hush, chu, shio, si, ksh, sh, shua, sui, chuk, sa, shu, sh, and so on, right? So there's a bit of variation, but there's also a predominance of a particular kind of sound. You heard that, I'm sure. So these words seem to show strong global similarities across unrelated language families. That's what's interesting. Why would that be? Well, it turns out there is a bit of research on this. So what kind of sound is this? First of all, linguists speak, of course, of sibilants or fricatives. And if you do a spectrogram of this, it looks a bit like this. So this is moving from sh via sh all the way to a s and back again, right? So that's what that looked like. Now, other people in a very different field have looked at the sound avoidance of hens. So basically, which sounds are hated by hens? What are the most aversive stimuli, basically? And it turns out, according to these scientists doing these kinds of experiments, it turns out that chickens really hate high-frequency continuous sounds, right? That's what the science says. Now, societies around the world are like, yeah, told you so, right? That's exactly what they found out. That's exactly what they are using across the world for this kind of action. And what I think happens here is this is a case of convergent adaptation to animal perceptual systems. So it's like probably many independent innovations, although borrowing, of course, is also a possibility. But people basically have independently hit on the fact that that's the most effective sound to shoo away chickens. That's basically what's going on. And in terms of a model of cultural evolution, you can think of these as of those sounds as becoming attractors, right? Biasing the transmission. So the more successful shooing words will survive because that's what you need to shoo away the chickens, and that's how they become almost universal. Now, what's interesting about this, and the reason I thought of this when thinking about this prototype of brain-to-brain interfaces, is this is what Skinner in '57 in Verbal Behavior described as bringing behavior under direct stimulus control. This is what that is. You utter a sound, it has a direct aversive effect on the perceptual system of the animal goes. That's basically what it is. Now, most of human language, of course, isn't like that at all. But this is. So this is a really a neat case, actually, of Skinner's bringing behavior under direct stimulus control. Now, is this language, you might wonder? I would say that this is at best, I mean, I'm generally quite permissive about what language is. And in fact, I don't care much about boundaries. But in this case, I think at least we can say this is at best a remote corner of language. This is language stripped of everything that makes it human or makes it humane. There is no creativity here. There's no body involved, really, except for this articulator making this sound and the animal basically just being chased away. There's no possibility of negotiation. You know, it's all or nothing. And there's certainly no possibility of selection, in the sense that also, interestingly, our own agency towards these animals is kind of limited, right? We cannot choose to say whatever we want, because only these kinds of sounds will be effective in shooing them away. So there's an interesting radical asymmetry in this kind of case. Okay, so creativity, embodiment, negotiation, selection. We've heard quite a lot about embodiment. I want to focus on the two last things there, negotiation and selection, because what I think is one useful way to think about languages as giving us two superpowers of negotiation and selection. And that's what I want to talk about in a little more detail. So let's start as negotiation. So negotiation, I'd say, is when we use language as an infrastructure for consent and dissent. So language in its everyday use, in the way we use it in interaction, provides this kind of infrastructure. This is very easy to see when you just look at any informal conversation at all. There's always the question, of course, what to do when it's your turn. And then the preferred thing to do in most cases is to provide a fitted response, right? You get asked a question. Now the expectation is that you'll provide an answer of some sort. And this branches out because that answer will, of course, be able to take many forms. But interestingly, there is another option, and there is always another option. Have you realized this? There is the option to initiate repair, to ask a clarification request. This is about the only linguistic action that's kind of legally, if you want to speak about rules, it's legally available at every turn in conversation. I'm talking informal conversation. You can't do this in court cases or in some other context. In fact, here too, I don't expect you at every turn to be able to initiate repair, although I invite you to if you need to. But we know there are special types of speech exchange situations. But in informal conversation, repair is always an option. And I noticed this when, in the course of doing field work, I encountered exchanges like this. So I don't even need to translate what happens here, because you can hear it, right? Somebody says something, then somebody goes, huh? And then we have a repetition of that first thing. This is one reason people call it repair. You can think of it as maybe as a tool to fix broken conversations. But I want to put a big question mark there, because it does much more than that. One indication that it does more than that is that it's incredibly frequent. So we looked at this in 12 languages around the world, plotting over time, how often are you going to encounter a clarification request like this? And then what it looks like is, in every language, in all of the 12 languages, barely 5 minutes go by and already you will have encountered one of those clarification requests. It could be huh, could be who, could be something else, but something that qualifies as a question about a prior turn that makes relevant a response in the next turn. So the average actually across all those languages is 84 seconds. It's quite incredible. So, one thing you could conclude from this is that without repair expressions, our interactions would be constantly derailed. And yet, we also use these kinds of expressions for other goals, in other ways. So it's not just about breakdowns or miscommunication. We actually have creative ways of using these things that give us a lot of agency. And this is the sense in which that is a superpower of negotiating mutual understanding or negotiating commitments. I want to walk through a simple example from my recordings. Not going to play the video, but just to explain, this is some people sitting and hanging around. They've just finished shelling this maze. Now they want to play a game. This thing is in the way. for playing that game, so needs to be moved out of the way. So this guy here, Sessi, is going to propose something about that. So he's saying, okay, so right, I'll lift this and put it in storage there. And he points to actually to the left here, so he wants to move that thing there. And then what we get, and so that's a proposal, right? And then what we get is something like a repair question. We get, what are you going to put in storage? We don't know whether Ben really doesn't get it, of course. It's a claim of misunderstanding in a way. It's an invitation to clarify. And so we get a clarification, just the maze. You know, that reference wasn't specified in Sessi's original terms, so looks like a simple repair sequence where, you know, something was unclear, now it's clarified, we can go on. But then Ben goes on and makes kind of a counter-proposal, or at least he says something about the maze that makes it now unnecessary for Sessi to do the thing that he proposed. This maze will actually be picked up right away. So in what he's saying, without explicitly saying it, is you don't need to go through the trouble of putting this stuff in storage, because somebody else will come along and pick it right up. Sessi kind of gets the point and says, okay, so they're going to take it down to the lower end of the village. So he actually understands this. Now what happens here is not just a case of misunderstanding. What happens really is that Ben here uses repair in a very friendly way, in a way to invite Sessi to revise his plans. So this is not really misunderstanding, at least that would be the most superficial analysis, right? This is Ben using repair in a way that avoids interactional turbulence. So it doesn't go straight against Sessi, but it helps Sessi to sort of revise his plans without seeming to really change his mind. And that's kind of a neat form of coordination and cooperation done right using language and using these kinds of repair techniques. Now there is another case about this that involves, the early years of conversational analysis, but for the reasons of time I'm gonna skip that. I'm just going to skip to the slide that I made as a conclusion for that, so we can walk through this dialogue. But actually, what happens here? This was a case of a helpline recordings that Harvey Sachs, an early sociologist in conversation analysis, analyzed, and they ran into this trouble that they couldn't get the name of the callers, which could be quite important if you're working at a helpline for people coping with thoughts of suicide, which was the case in this case. So they had this trouble that the helpline volunteers couldn't get names. And one thing they found was that a recurring strategy by which people evaded giving their name was to initiate repair. So once again, it didn't need to be the case that they actually didn't hear it, but it could also have been a strategy for skipping a move, because that's what repair is, right? Repair enables you to skip a move and withhold your name without actually being seen to outrightly refuse it. So that's again a strategic possibility of repair. So all this is part of kind of conversation for, and not for beginners, but for the advanced. These are the kinds of tricks that we use in conversation every day. And this is the sense in which we negotiate our commitments and are able to use repair to renegotiate, to revise our commitments and our joint commitments. So this is the sense in which language, through the machinery of repair, ostensibly just for fixing misunderstandings, gives us agency to revise joint commitments. So there's a larger body of work here that I'm just hinting at, and I'm just going to leave aside here, where we look at universal principles governing this kind of use of repair, and where we try to understand how people coordinate using these kinds of techniques. But the summary so far of this part about the negotiation superpower is that conversation provides at every turn, literally, at every turn, opportunities to co-construct and to revise or to revoke our joint commitments. And this is an extremely powerful feature of conversation. That is, if you think about it, lost in that crude brain-to-brain prototype. So repair emerges as kind of a Swiss knife of social interaction. You can use it for so many things, and I don't think it's sensible to always call it repair, or at least let's not pretend it's always about communicative breakdowns. We can be much more creative than that. Which brings me to the second superpower that language gives us, selection. And this is about language functioning as a filter between private worlds and public worlds. Simple example is just, this ubiquitous question, how are you? Where you will all realize that a truthful and a complete and a comprehensive answer is often uncalled for, right? You don't want to hear that in some cases. There are cases where you do, but then you know that. That's part of how we build social relations, in knowing when to give a complete and truthful answer to this question and when to just go, fine, and you, right? So I would say that language in this kind of case, and this is just a little microcosm of how we use language in general, is kind of a public-private filter, and without which social life as we know it would not be possible. So these kinds of, and actually this is, again, Harvey Sachs, this sociologist and conversation analyst, really put his finger on it when he said, everyone has to lie. So these white lies, we sometimes call them, really, without them, we would not have social life as we know it. But that's one form of selectivity. Some things are better left unsaid, basically. There's another form of selectivity, which is that just even when you choose to say something, there is almost infinite choice of things you could say, right? So you make your choice based on the situation, based on the person you're interacting with. And so once again, we can go to this simple everyday interaction in that mountain village in Ghana to see an example of that. So Sessi is actually still wanting to move this thing out of the way. We'll discover why in a minute. But so we know he's probably not going to put it in storage, right? Also, what you can see is that this is hard for one person to handle. So we need a form of distributed agency. We need some way of organizing another linguistic body to actually do this work. And so what happens is he goes, wait, Afua. And Afua is the girl in the background here. So he calls for her attention. And then we get her attention. She looks up. Following which he asks her, he basically tries to recruit her for this action. Grab this with me, so we put it right here. Right here, now pointing to his right. So he basically wants to put it just 1 meter to the side. But we get silence, 1.6 seconds. Now that may seem short, but in conversation, that's an eternity. I mean, literally. If you request something from someone and they wait for 1.6 seconds, something is up. So you need to find another way of getting their compliance, or maybe you need to find another person. In this case, Sessi finds another way. And this is, again, the power of selection, the power of having multiple available formulations. So in this case, what he does is really neat, actually. He says, let us put this to the side. He makes it a we, so you can come and play this thing. Remember, there's a board game involved, right? So one person is holding a game. And so he makes it about a common project, a project for us, and also he turns her into a beneficiary. So it's like saying, but this is going to help you. So, you better just, help me out here. And then it just happens like that. They lift this tub together, place it 1 meter to the side, and then we get a nice little completion marker, and then people sit down to play this game. What do we learn from this? Well, that we learn that in everyday, in informal interaction, distributed agency is always an interactional achievement. It takes work to get there. And we can look to Malinowski for early observations on this, but also to the work of Margaret Gilbert, for instance, on walking together as a social phenomenon, as an interactional achievement, for models on how to theorize about this. But distributed agency is an interactional achievement. It's one way of summarizing this. Now, once again, there is a larger body of work here that I'm basically just leaving aside, hinting at only. We've looked at when people give reasons for requests, as happens in this case. This is interesting because it gives you a way to get at these things that are normally left unsaid, the reasons that we attribute to others. And then we've also looked at how people recruit each other in everyday life. And we've found that there's you can think of a kind of coercion, of different ways of asking somebody, fully embodied, when you just hold something up and the other person really cannot ignore you because otherwise you'll be, falling or something. And so basically you coerce them into doing it, versus fully verbal, in which case more often you also get partly a verbal response in addition to the non-verbal response. Anyway, so that's a larger body of work. But all of this just points to negotiation and selection being really, really important aspects of language, both of which are ignored in this larger body of engineering work on brain-to-brain interfaces so far. So what I would want to claim is that negotiation and selection are features, not bugs. So remember this quote that I started out with from Murray Gell-Mann saying, with none of the selectivity and deception that language permits. Well, I would say selectivity and deception are actually really, really important features of language. They are part of what gives us our agency. They are part of what allows us to use language as a way to coordinate bodies while not relinquishing personal autonomy, personal agency, personal flexibility. So we can use language to temporarily join forces with someone else, like Ceci and Afua lifting this tub together. They do that and they, for a moment, become one in that sense. Their agency is fused. It's made into a joint commitment. But it's only a temporary kind of construction made possible by language. And after that, both of them, of course, can just go on. And in fact, the way Afua didn't respond to the first formulation and kind of had to be convinced, that's another way in which language is really key in giving agency. It makes it possible to refuse, sometimes outright, but sometimes also without officially refusing to do something. So there are opportunities for consent and dissent built into the very structure of talk in interaction. And those are the kinds of things that we don't want to lose sight of when building brain-to-brain interfaces. This is a slime mold. It's probably nature's best example of a mind meld. In the sense that, this is lots of cytoplasm merged into an amoeba of single-celled simplicity. Many of these kinds of things are unicellular. Under some circumstances, they become multicellular. They are still simple. There's lots of direct communication between the elements. They are also, to some degree, clever. They are good at finding food, for instance. And they are even capable, according to some findings, of elementary forms of learning. So there's a lot going on here. But I think we'll agree that there's not a lot of individual agency left for the cytoplasms or for the cells fused into this kind of form. And I think that is kind of a metaphor for the state of brain-to-brain interfaces right now. Linking brains is already technologically feasible, even in less crude ways than the prototype that I showed. There are interesting ways of for instance, enlarging the bandwidth for information transmission and so on. And people are really working hard on making this a reality. But I think the real challenge here is to ensure that it doesn't turn people into essentially parts of a larger amoeba without any personal autonomy and without any personal agency left. So what's hard here is enabling agency and autonomy when fusing agency or when distributing agency. And this is, I think, what language is really an interesting model for. The extreme flexibility that it affords us in building joint projects, in merging persons in some sense even, and yet also going out. It's kind of efficient fusion sociality. That's what language allows. We can join forces when we want. We can share information with whom we want, but we can also retreat. We can revise. We can revoke commitment. And one lesson that I take from the ubiquity of these headlines about brain-to-brain interfaces is that as interdisciplinary language scientists, which I think is maybe one way of characterizing this audience, I think we need to up our outreach game. If this is not known about language, if these superpowers of language are not kind of seen as anything interesting, if the idea that engineers making these kinds of prototypes, if the idea that they have about language is just that it makes expression hard, or it allows for deception, or there's lots of misunderstanding, and if only we connected our brains, we would get past all those misunderstandings. If it's still possible to have these kinds of very simplistic encoding, decoding frameworks about language, then we have our work cut out for us, essentially. There's lots of work to do for us to explain this more encompassing view of language as contextualized, as embodied, as interactive. Now the ideas that I've been sharing here, I've written up in a very short form in a chapter in this book on distributed agency from 2 years ago. I mean, there's lots of other more interesting chapters probably in that book too. So it's worth checking out. Edited by Nick Enfield and Paul Cockerman. So I think to sum up, I started with these chickens, right? And so that's manipulation. That's the lowest degree of autonomy on the part of the chicken, but also in a way actually on the part of the humans, right? So we have limited options with chickens. Language, talk and interaction, gives us a lot more autonomy. And brain-to-brain interfaces at the moment are, I'm afraid, just at the level of simple brute force manipulation. They're at the level of forcing someone to go out of the room, pushing them out of the room, rather than persuading them to leave using language. And what I hope for the future of brain-to-brain interfaces, because, you know, as I said, this technology is here to stay. It is being developed actively. What I hope is that at least we can get it to the level of talk and interaction in allowing both of these superpowers of negotiation and of selection. If we have that, then at least we have preserved our sense of agency. Now, whether we can even get it higher than that, I don't know. We might, but certainly not if we keep at the level of these crude prototypes. Okay. I just want to mention that is this topic. It's been a long interest of mine, but it's also a bit out of left field even for me. So I do this besides work in another project that I'm funded on right now, where we look at the elementary particles of conversation. And this, you can see that the themes kind of fit with what we've talked about in the workshop and also what I've talked about with brain-to-brain interfaces today. So in this project we study how linguistic resources, like the resources we have for repair, but also other kinds of linguistic resources, like meta-communicative signals, how these enable the interactively scaffolded, the materially augmented, and the socially distributed form of human agency that we've basically come to take for granted in human interaction, but that certainly should not be taken for granted when we think about future technologies. So I'll just, end on this slide about negotiation and selection, the two superpowers that language gives us. Thank you for your attention.
For this great talk. Do we have any questions? Dan was first.
Thanks a lot. So, I'll be on the side of the neuroscientists, right? Because I mean, they're not the only ones to have weird, fucked up views of language. I mean, linguists have.
Okay.
On one hand, on the other, I mean, this is just starting up. You have to start somewhere, and TMS is hard to do, huh?
Oh yeah.
On the other hand, I mean, I hope that people will adapt to the new communicative system the way we adapted to language when language started, huh? So I don't know. This is just stuff out there. These are not really questions, but just comments. So.
Yeah. No, I agree with first of all with your point about linguists. They've been missing out on this kind of interactive perspective on language for centuries, basically. Surely, yeah. So we can't really blame the engineers or the neuroscientists for missing that point, and I'm not trying to, but technology has certain affordances and brings certain constraints. So for instance, if you use TMS and this kind of thing, basically your options are going to be extremely limited and probably limited to this involuntary kind of twitching of limbs. And so you might wonder whether that's the right way to go at all. What I've seen in more recent work on this is actually that people try to incorporate some form of feedback or of negotiation. What's really interesting to me is that they simply cannot, and therefore I think should not try, they cannot avoid using language. basically. I mean, the people that they are doing these experiments with are obviously linguistic bodies, to use Helena's term. And so that's going to be a fact. And so I'm actually quite optimistic about the possibility to implement some form of negotiation and some form of selection. So some form of a back and forth and some form of a public-private distinction, even in these kinds of brain-to-brain interfaces. I'm optimistic, but I think people need to be aware of the possibility to plan for it in a way, or to allow it to emerge technologically. And this is also why I've tried to frame it in as constructive way as possible. Boom! Yeah, wake up.
Thank you so much. So I have kind of two not very thought out reactions, but firstly, on what you were just saying, so I appreciate your optimism, but I mean, if they're linguistic bodies, then putting their two brain, they're right, they're bypassing language because that's not language. Brain to brain interaction is not language in any kind of meaningful way. Maybe you could have linguistic body to linguistic body interaction that also has some measurement of brain activity going on, but that would be a different paradigm, right? Okay, then I have a wild card for you. So much of your talk made me think about sexual assault, which I know is not what you were going for. But this question about agency, negotiation, selection, private and public filtering. And so this is an arena, I've looked at it just a little bit with participatory sense making, but where our superpowers are failing. And I'm thinking of the work about Ray Langton elaborating speech act theory and this question of uptake and whether or not women are enabled to say no and have there be uptake. So this is not just my wacky idea. This is like a robust industry and feminist philosophy of language, right? But your way of talking about these resources, I don't know, I just want to think through it again. So I don't know if you have any initial reactions to that topic.
I do. So in that chapter I also write, so the reason I call them humane is that they are in a way really what makes us human. And in that chapter I also draw attention to other contexts in which these superpowers are systematically taken away. Religious indoctrination is another one, where you're not even allowed to question stuff. Torture is another one that I mentioned there. Where your power for negotiating and for consent and dissent is systematically taken away, and so I think that's the dark side of this of this kind of work, and it made me think about this because once again I tried to be as constructive and optimistic as possible because I also think that if you're just the doomsday prophet or the grumpy linguist saying, oh, you guys have no understanding whatsoever of language, then you're certainly not going to get a hearing. And so I tried to be as constructive as possible in that chapter, but I couldn't help but get these ideas, also about more brute force forms of manipulation in other, in cross-species communication, like these terrible brain parasites that affect their victims in ways that take away all of their agency. So there are all sorts of parallels all across the natural and the social world that are a bit terrifying, to be honest, but really relevant.
So the slime mold, that's basically the same as the Borg in Star Trek, right? And we don't want that. But I'm actually wondering why we don't want that. And I really don't want it, and you don't want it, and maybe I guess but is there a good reason for not wanting it? I mean, can we, because there are these sort of post-humanist, futurist, singularity people saying, well, that's just the next step, that's the next phase, we're going to, like AI is going to surpass us, we're going to be all connected, and we're going to be all uploading ourselves to whatever. And I want to have a good argument saying that this, except from just a feeling.
Well, so what I've tried to argue is that there's a very concrete way in which the way we use language and interaction affords us these kinds of this form of agency. So and what the Borg, you will be assimilated. that is, again, about taking away all agency and basically just being assimilated until you're part of an undifferentiated mass. So this is about losing all individuality and losing all agency. And yeah, maybe it's just that as individuals ourselves, we don't like this idea. For me, that's actually sufficient. The idea of losing all agency. Yeah, because what I have come to appreciate so much about language is that it allows us to join forces, to distribute agency, to become one with one another. But then we can disengage again. This is what language, this is the power that language at least gives us. Not in all cases, but at base that is afforded by the infrastructure of language. And so, yeah, I think that's, it might still be only a feeling, but at least we can make the observation that there is a real loss of agency involved. When you join people in this particular way, you just lose agency, and that's, you know, you can just point to that. And, you know, how you feel about that. If some people are happy with that, that's fine with me. But I think you'll find that most people like having a bit of agency and flexibility and accountability.
It's, thank you very much for an interesting talk. You said that you were trying to be as constructive as possible, and then you pointed out that if you want to do this brain-to-brain interface, you have to incorporate these elements of negotiation and selection. But you didn't really say why we would even want it, because the people that were enthusiastic about it, you said, well, that's not a good reason for being enthusiastic about it. So I wondered, do you have a good reason for being enthusiastic about it?
That's a good question. Funding. Getting lots of money.
The best reason.
No, so actually I can, I mean, this is maybe for the same reason that people like taking pot or LSD together. It is interesting to be, you know, to be part of this sense of. So I mean, that's the kind of the low-tech way of getting a mind meld, I suppose, and people like it a lot. It is consensual in most cases, and this is one way in which, and in fact, I mean, you don't even need to give the example of chemicals. Even really good conversations can give you that sense of a mind meld, right? And so there is something extremely attractive about it. So if there is technology that might bring that within reach in a different way, that, you know, it's just, I guess, also part of human nature to be interested in that. So I totally get that, and I wouldn't disapprove of that in principle. But, you know, we, as always with technology, we do need to think through, preferably before we have it, to think through the ethical implications. I don't know whether that's a really good answer or satisfying answer to you, but at least I understand people's fascination with this possibility. Yeah, so I mean, it's there's a lot of sci-fi, of course, also going into this, which is I can recommend Ramesh Nam's trilogy on mind melds. I'm blanking on the name right now, but you know, he's written about this in a fair bit of detail and in interesting ways. But also importantly, building in possibilities for negotiation and for consent. So before you enter into this kind of mind meld situation, there is an opportunity to say, yes, we are going to do this right now together. Those kinds of things are really key, I think, to that technology.
This is kind of a follow-on to both of the two previous questions. I think your answer there was, again, probably because we're all in this room quite, if not utopian, kind of progressive, have these ideas about the individuals and that. But I wonder if your reason for liking the brain-computer interface is actually quite different from that of the engineers. It seems to me that the engineers' reason for liking it is likely to be grounded in like our kind of dominant ideology of resource and resource efficiency. And I think that because of that, I worry if because of that the objections that we're putting to this and the things that we're saying we need to defend, agency, will be treated as other previous pieties have been treated as pieties. So I wonder if we kind of have a choice when we're approaching these two things of either calling out that issue of the logic of resource, which stands behind this, and critiquing that more deeply, or accepting that logic of resource and finding an argument within that system. And I think you can actually make arguments in both cases. In this case, from a kind of systems perspective, you would want to say that a certain amount of friction in any system, when you look at any system analytic case, is required for things not to become accelerate into chaos. And while there's a small group of weird right-wing philosophers at the minute who like that idea, I think most people would probably not like that idea. I wonder if those are our two choices.
Excellent point. I don't have much to add to it. I think it's really important to also think, from the universe of that, engineering mindset in a way. Besides trying to undermine that view in the first place, you can also say there is something to this view, and let's try from within that universe try and address it. Yeah, I haven't thought a lot about how to do that. But I can add that in those publications where they write about those prototypes, really it seems to be a dissatisfaction with our pesky bodily limitations and with the limited expressiveness of language and so on. The people seem just to be annoyed about that. Why can I not simply, as in the Matrix, upload skills into my brain? It really seems to be behind it. That's. I don't know quite how to engage with those ideas, because if that's what's being thought, then it's hard to argue against it.
So I have another follow-up question,
Yeah.
and then Dan, sorry.
I'm glad I left a little bit of time for discussion, because.
My feeling of why it's so difficult to up the game on this and being constructive is, I don't have personally a need to upgrade my bandwidth in terms of communication with a person when I'm having a conversation. But there are other problems involved with language, which are not the problems that are trying to be addressed by these kind of technologies. So, the first point would be, I find it very difficult to up a game and being constructive in that in that frame, because I have no need for what that technology is, the solution that that technology is trying to propose. And on the other hand, I think it would maybe be a lot more constructive to try and show, maybe along the lines of what Didier was talking about, or Elena, and how there are problems not only in the ways in which language is subversed globally today, but maybe how that can be boiled down to problems that would still be there even without a global subversion of the way we use language today. Try to reframe there are problems, there are technological problems today. Like, for instance, Dynamic Land, among many other things that it answers a very pressing problem. We're very deep into bad computers. So we need better computers, and a better idea of computing. But in terms of communication, what are we very deep bad into? I don't really know what would be the answer to that question.
Well, we can branch out in many different directions from here, but I'll just mention one thing, and this is the reason that I call these things features, not bugs. It doesn't just apply to brain-to-brain interface. That's like the sci-fi scenario that I chose to address in this particular work. But we already in our everyday linguistic lives, we are increasingly talking to devices that to different degrees can cope with both negotiation and selection. So, take just Alexa, Siri, Google Home. We already are adapting our own speech to the limitations and constraints of these devices, right? So that's just giving up a bit of power in selection on the selection end. And we already have learned to cope with the fact that these devices are really, really bad at negotiation, right? So they basically all they can do is go, huh? Give a flag, an error signal, and they're not very clever or helpful in identifying a particular problem and allowing us to solve it very quickly. So on both these ends, even the present day technology that is ubiquitous and that many of us are already working with, could benefit a lot from the insights that that language scientists working in this area are generating. Maybe that it's one direction in which one could take it.
Quick, coming back to the arguments for, against, if these are bugs or blah blah blah, and the engineering point of view. So first, I don't think there is an engineering point of view, and second, no stereotyping. But I used to work in the software industry, right? And some of my colleagues, super sharp, super smart, but definitely would prefer not to have to use language, just to connect to each other and just get it done, huh? Without all this repair, the social game of getting, the meaning through, negotiating the whole situation, la 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 la. So it might be a thing about individual differences. Huh? It might not work for us because we chose this, what we're doing, for a reason, but it might work for other people that didn't choose to do this for another reason. Huh? I'm just saying. Huh?
Yeah, true. And also, some of those people will be the same people that prefer Soylent over having dinner with friends. Yeah, but I think it's fine to allow that and to even celebrate these kinds of differences. But we should, at the very least, try to avoid those kinds of views to dictate the direction technology is taken in. And so that's one reason for me to actually just look at language in the most informal kinds of settings around the world, to just study how language serves us in enabling our agency, our common and joint agency, and our humanity. And just trying to understand that better, for me, is in itself a satisfying goal. And I take it as a given indeed that some people will have other goals and would like to avoid language.
I will.
Would you like to avoid language?
Yeah. Actually, no. I mean, it depends how it's done, but if you find a way to kind of connect two brains and give the whole information of the brain when you want to give it, so not all the time and not just the language part, but all of the brain, then you decide to send information. It would be like pure communication. And it would be a language that people would still interact with each other. So I would think something and I would give it to someone, and my idea would be pure, like real communication, and the people could answer, and it could be conversation kind of, so it could be like languages, but it's like sign languages. It's languages but without words, and this communication could be language but without words.
But yes,
and
but
for me this is language somehow, and I would
well,
love it. No war, no misunderstandings. I don't know.
That's the part I don't get, actually, that you really could believe that there would be no more misunderstandings, because that seems to, doesn't that imply that there is, we are all essentially uniform cognitively, and if only we connect that system, that we can, but that's a huge assumption to
no
make.
war was too much, but still less misunderstandings is still a good assumption, I think.
Well, as I've tried to show and I've tried to argue, it's not just misunderstandings, of course. It's the fact that the repair machinery gives us agency to make others revise plans without actually causing a lot of turbulence. So there's value even in that kind of use of repair.
But if you think the contrary, let's imagine that we're living in a world where everyone is communicating brain with brain, and then suddenly someone has the ideas like, oh, okay, let's stop that. Let's create a language with words, and it's complicated, and no one speaks the same language, and there's accent, there is misunderstandings. Who is going to say yes? Oh, wow, let's go for language.
I want to also, I want to briefly, give credit to Douglas Adams for coming up with this kind of thought experiment. He wrote about the Belcerebon people of Kakrafun, that they were inflicted with that most cruel of all social diseases, telepathy. And there's as the whole of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a lot of wisdom in these kinds of words. Oh, I see so many figures. I don't know where to start.
I also just wanted to point out that in response to what you said, and what I also take from embodied cognitive science, is the opposition to the Cartesian idea that in our brain there are clear and distinct ideas, and the only problem we have is in getting them out. And I don't buy into that. I mean, we don't understand ourselves. If you want to understand yourself, you have to do stuff in the world. You have to talk to other people. You have to. You don't understand yourself. So I think the pure communication that you envision buys into a view of ideas or the mental, which is just not in line with how we actually think.
See also Andy Clark's work on.
No, stick to your position.
Sorry.
You have a good point. Like there are these guys, they're saying, oh, it's so fun walking, and she just wants a fast train.
Yeah.
You get to your destination, all this walking and experiencing.
It's true, but you will be stuck on the train forever. If you're okay with that, then.
Walking still goes faster than a fairy tale train.
Ideas would have to be mental representation. Thank you. Ideas would have to be mental representations which can be encoded using digits 0, 1, 0, 1, and in that case you would be able to download them and upload them. That's exactly. And if you want to do that, just replace your brain by a computer, and then it'll work. But actually, what happens is that thinking is an act. It's an embodied act, and you don't detect it as such, precisely because your brain does not need. Does not possess the reflexive nervous loops which would make it possible for it to detect its own activity. Because when you move your hand, you have proprioception, which makes it possible for you to detect yourself. And you know yourself as a living being. You don't know your brain as a living being. You never detect its own activity. And for one reason, if you detected it, you would start doubting about your own existence, because you would be aware of your own brain creating your mind. And the mind is what is left of the brain's activity as soon as the brain activity becomes undetectable. It remains behind the curtain. It's exactly like in the film The Matrix, because in The Matrix you experience something which is concealed behind the curtain of the Matrix, the computers. And in this case you are in the Matrix, but the Matrix is your own body. Your brain is true. That's exactly, and I wrote about that several times. So this is what makes thinking undownloadable, precisely, because you cannot make a direct connection between two brains unless you dissolve the frontier, the border between those two brains. And in that case, it's not only a loss of agency, it's a loss of identity. Because what is lost is the border, the boundary between individuals. You simply cease to exist as a unit, and you become one neuron among a complex one, of course, but one complex neuron among a community of other neurons. And I don't want to be that. I hope it's not possible.
No, but yeah, you actually did, in your favor, you actually said it would be preceded by consent, and it would be kind of selective in some ways, but it's just that you want a direct connection, a high bandwidth direct connection for information transmission, essentially, right? And yeah, I mean, I can get behind that in a way, but we need to find ways to preserve identity, flexibility, autonomy, and agency.
So as much as I'm loving this conversation, there are very interesting posters that we're going to set up outside, and more food. So I think we should move to the hall and go and talking about this outside.
Can we just, while we're all together here, give a round of thanks to you?
Indeed. Indeed. Thank you, Sebastian, for getting together this wonderfully diverse set of participants. It's
So actually I have to also to thank Eric Nisha, who was the one who pushed me to do this after listening to too many rants. Who pushed me to get some funding for a workshop like this. And thank you very much for all coming and making this possible and making it exist.